In the quiet pages of forgotten maps, there lies a name that once stretched across nearly half a continent, only to fade as though it had never been written. That name was Tartaria. During the 17th century, some of Europe's most respected cartographers gave this name a firm and lasting place on their maps. On Joan Bleu's Grand Atlas of 1645, the word Tartaria spread across Siberia and Central Asia. It was marked with rivers, mountains and provinces, drawn not as empty space, but as if outlining a vast empire, widely recognized in its time. For generations afterward, atlases and books repeated the name, treating it as part of the known world. By the middle of the 19th century, however, the picture had changed. Open an atlas from around 1850, and Tartaria is gone. The land once gathered under that name is now divided into Russia, Siberia, Mongolia, and Central Asia. Even encyclopedias that once described it in detail grew silent, as if the word itself had been quietly set aside and allowed to fade from memory. A presence that had lasted for centuries seemed to disappear within a single lifetime. And yet, something remains. Walk through Moscow's Red Square, and you may see domes rising like painted flames against the sky. To most, they are symbols of Russia. Yet echoes of those same shapes appear in cities along the old trade routes, as if fragments of a style once stretched across a far wider land, still whispering through stone. The official explanation is simple. Most historians agree that Tartary was never an empire. They say it was only a broad label used by Europeans for regions they did not fully understand, and for the nomadic peoples who moved across the steppes. In this view, the maps were not records of one civilization, but a convenient name that gathered many distant lands under a single word. Still, the persistence of that name is striking. Why did it remain in European knowledge for centuries, only to vanish so suddenly? Was it merely a habit of language, or the fading memory of something greater, a culture that left behind traces in architecture, in legend, and in forgotten records, before being quietly set aside? Tonight, we will explore this mystery. We will follow the history of the name, from the maps that carried it, to the theories that try to explain it. We will see what archaeology and old texts reveal, and where speculation begins. And as we move deeper, we may discover that Tartaria is not just a forgotten word, but a doorway into the way history itself is written, remembered, and sometimes erased. If a thought or a question lingers with you, share it in the comments. And if you wish to drift further into mysteries like this one, leave a like, subscribe, and stay close. The stories that follow will be here whenever you return. To trace the beginnings of Tartaria, we must look at the earliest records that pointed toward its existence. The story does not begin with modern historians, but with the maps, the travellers, and the remains left deep in the earth. In 1595, after Gerardus Mercator had passed away, his atlas was published. Across the north of Asia, the name Tartaria appeared, stretching from the Caspian Sea to the edge of the Arctic. To his European audience, it signalled that this was not an empty wilderness, but a vast region with shape, scale, and identity. Yet maps only give outlines. To learn about the people themselves, we turn to travellers who ventured east along the Silk Road. The most famous among them was Marco Polo. Between 1271 and 1295, Polo crossed deserts, mountains and steppes, and in his account he described the Tartar, the people who roamed those lands. He wrote of the endless grasslands where riders could travel for days without seeing the end of the horizon. He spoke of cities built at trading crossroads, where merchants carried silk, spices and gems. He described markets filled with voices in many languages, and customs unlike anything known in Venice. Polo's tales were not just travel notes. They became Europe's first wide introduction to the cultures of the interior of Asia. Through his eyes, readers saw both the richness and the danger of the lands beyond the familiar empires. He wrote of rulers who commanded thousands of horsemen, of fortresses that rose from the plains, and of cities that glowed with trade. Whether every detail was accurate or not, his words created an image of strength and organization. For Europeans, the Tartars were no longer faceless wanderers. They were a people with power, and perhaps even with states of their own. Centuries later, archaeology confirmed that these lands held far more than nomadic camps. In the high Altai Mountains of Siberia, a frozen burial mound preserved secrets for over 2,000 years. In 1947, excavations at Pazyryk revealed a Scythian kurgan, a great tomb built for chiefs of the steppe. Inside, the frozen ground had sealed treasures almost untouched by time. There was a woven carpet, still coloured, its knots so fine that experts call it the oldest known pile carpet in the world. There were ornaments of gold, shaped into deer and griffins with curves that caught the light. A wooden chariot, carefully carved, lay beside the bodies of horses. Their hides were tattooed with swirling designs. Even the humans buried there bore tattoos, signs of art and belief. This was not the work of a primitive tribe. It was the legacy of a culture with artisanship, ritual and wealth. The Scythians of Pazyryk showed that the steppe had long nurtured societies with both skill and vision. These discoveries connect with the written records from the south. In ancient Chinese chronicles, we find mention of a great nation of the north, known as Da Guo. The texts describe envoys arriving from beyond the desert, sometimes bringing exotic gifts, sometimes demanding recognition. At times, they were allies who traded animals unknown in China. At other times, they were enemies who tested the strength of walls. Whatever their role, they were acknowledged as organized and powerful. The lands beyond the Great Wall were not void. They were populated by peoples who shaped history at the edges of empire. Taken together, these fragments begin to form a picture. The maps that mark Tartaria across half of Asia, the travel accounts that spoke of Tartars in thriving cities, the frozen tombs of the Scythians that revealed art and wealth, the chronicles that acknowledged a great nation of the north, all point to a story larger than wandering tribes. These were cultures with continuity, skill, and reach. They may not have been united under a single crown in the way Europe understood empire, but they left behind signs of scale and power. The question is, how we interpret these signs. Mainstream history sees them as separate threads. Marco Polo wrote of the Mongol world, "The Scythians belong to an earlier age." The Chinese recorded encounters with neighbours, not with a vast empire. In this view, Tartary was only the shorthand Europeans used to gather many peoples under one convenient name. And yet, the persistence of that name across maps, the scale of Polo's descriptions, the richness of the Pazyryk finds, and the weight of the Chinese accounts all suggest more. If these were only fragments, why did the maps insist on marking them as a whole? And if the northern lands were empty, how did they produce art and wealth that rivaled the settled kingdoms of the south? Perhaps the truth lies between. Tartaria may not have been a single empire in the strict sense, but a tradition of power across the steppes, shifting through ages yet remembered as one vast presence. A memory that Europeans came to call Tartaria, even as its reality blurred with time. And if these are only the beginnings, the maps, the travels, the tombs, the chronicles, what greater mysteries might appear when we look deeper? What achievements, what secrets, might still wait in the heart of Tartaria? If this story kept you company tonight, leave a like to help it reach others. When we look beyond the origins of Tartaria, the question becomes not only who its people may have been, but also what they achieved. The traces they left in stone, in design, and in legend suggest more than scattered tribes. They hint at a culture capable of great works, though much about those works remains mysterious. Across the lands once labelled as Tartary, certain architectural patterns rise again and again. Domes shaped like flames curve toward the sky, topped with metal caps that catch the light. One of the earliest examples is the street, Sophia Cathedral in Kiev, built in the 11th century, its domes gleaming above the city as a symbol of faith. Centuries later, in Moscow, the vivid towers of St. Basil's Cathedral, completed in 1561, became the most famous of these monuments. From the 16th through the 18th centuries, such domes and towers multiplied, scattered across Russia and beyond. History tells us they were artistic choices, influenced by Byzantine models and local tradition. Yet some researchers suggest another possibility, that these forms may have carried a forgotten purpose. The metal caps, the curves of the domes, and the soaring spires may once have been more than decoration, perhaps even part of a system for harnessing natural forces. Adding to this enigma are the strange windows often seen at the lowest levels of old buildings. In city after city, from Moscow to St. Petersburg and beyond, windows appear half buried below today's ground level. To most, this is explained as the result of rebuilding, the raising of streets over centuries. But to those who search for deeper causes, it is evidence of a mud flood, a sudden catastrophe in the 18th or 19th century that covered the lower floors of whole cities in Earth. If true, it would mean that much of what we see today are only the upper levels of structures far older than we imagine. Was this only a quirk of urban change, or the trace of a disaster that left its mark on an entire continent? The towers and spires themselves carry their own mystery. To most eyes, they are symbols of heaven, their bells once marking the hours of prayer. But some modern researchers, such as David Ewing Jr., have pointed to their resemblance to later designs by Nikola Tesla, who experimented with wireless energy. The tall spires, the metal crosses, the domes aligned in clusters all echo the forms of antennas. Could it be that centuries earlier, builders had discovered ways to draw power from the air, ways we no longer understand? A handful of engravings from the 19th century seem to add to the puzzle. They show machines described as etheric or electrical, devices that suggest an attempt to capture energies beyond the visible. Their origin is uncertain, and historians dismiss them as curiosities. Yet their very existence fuels the idea that some forgotten science was once known, then lost, or perhaps deliberately hidden. If the towers were truly machines, then they were not only monuments of faith but instruments of a technology that has slipped from memory. But if they were only symbols, why do they echo so closely the designs of energy collectors from centuries later? Beyond architecture and technology, the soil itself reveals traces of cultures more complex than legend allows. In 1987, in the southern Ural Mountains, archaeologists uncovered the ruins of a settlement unlike any other. They called it Archaim. From above, its design was clear. The city was circular, built with two concentric walls and streets that radiated outward like spokes. Its plan suggested both defense and harmony, as though it had been designed with a higher order in mind. Radiocarbon dating placed it at about 4,000 years old. What astonished researchers even more was its relation to the sky. The streets and walls were aligned with the movements of the sun and stars, allowing its inhabitants to mark solstices and equinoxes. Archaim functioned as both a settlement and an observatory, a northern Stonehenge laid out with mathematical precision. For conventional scholars, Archaim was a Bronze Age city of the Sintashta culture, a people known for their chariots and metallurgy. But others see it differently. To them, it was a spiritual centre, a hub of astronomical and cultural knowledge, perhaps even a capital of the civilization later remembered as Tartaria. If such places once dotted the steppes, then our understanding of prehistory may be incomplete. Were these circles only villages of herders and warriors, or were they the last remnants of an advanced culture whose name has been forgotten? When we gather these fragments together, a pattern takes shape. Domes and towers rise across cities, repeating a form whose purpose is still debated. Windows lie buried below the ground, as if the earth itself once rose to cover them. Bell towers resemble instruments of energy, hinting at a science out of place in their time. Cities like Archaim reveal precision in astronomy and geometry far beyond the needs of daily survival. Each detail could be explained in ordinary ways, and yet, taken together, they point to something larger, a story that resists being simple coincidence. The question lingers. Were these only the works of scattered peoples, each solving the same problems in similar ways, or were they signs of a wider culture, one that stretched across half the world and left monuments too large to erase? And if such a culture did exist, how did it vanish so completely, leaving only fragments of stone, whispers of energy, and ruins half buried in the earth? Every civilization that rises must also face decline. But with Tartaria, the puzzle is not only how it ended, but how it disappeared so completely, leaving behind almost nothing but shadows on old maps. Some turn first to the earth itself. The theory is known as the mud flood, and it begins with the strange sight we noticed earlier, old buildings with their ground floors buried beneath the soil. In St. Petersburg, in Moscow, even in parts of Paris, Whole rows of windows lie half hidden below street level, as if the ground has risen up against the walls. To most, this is explained as centuries of rebuilding or the gradual raising of roads. But others see it differently. They imagine not a slow process, but a sudden catastrophe, a flood of mud and water that swept through cities in the 18th and 19th centuries, covering lower floors and leaving only the upper stories in view. In St. Petersburg, there is one record that adds fuel to this vision. In 1824, the Neva River surged through the city in a devastating flood. Diaries describe boats carried into the streets, houses washed away, thousands of homes destroyed. It was, for the people who lived it, a disaster without equal. Mainstream history treats it as a natural storm, terrible but ordinary. Yet to those who believe in the mud flood, it is a fragment of a larger event, one of many waves that may have reshaped whole regions, leaving us to inherit a landscape already half buried. If that were true, then perhaps what we call 18th century architecture is in fact only the surviving crown of older buildings, their foundations hidden beneath the earth. And if so, what else might lie entombed, sealed away where no one now looks? Not everyone sees catastrophe in soil, others see erasure in politics. By the mid-19th century, the Russian Empire had expanded deep into Central Asia. Tsarist armies marched east, drawing borders and planting flags across the steppe. The empire did not only conquer with soldiers, it also conquered with maps. As territories were absorbed, the name Tartaria was quietly replaced. Provinces were redrawn, their labels rewritten as Russia, Siberia, Mongolia, Turkestan. One of the last maps to carry the old name was the John Tallis map of 1851, printed in England. After that, Tartary vanishes almost entirely from Western atlases. What had once stretched across half a continent now appeared only as fragments under the rule of others. To some, this is proof of nothing more than changing cartography. But to others, it is the mark of deliberate removal, the victory of empire over memory. For what is an empire, if not the power to decide not only who rules but what is remembered? Imagine standing in a 19th century library. On one shelf lies a dusty Russian volume from the 18th century. Its pages speak of Great Tartary, a political entity, a vast dominion beyond the Urals. Yet on another shelf, written a century later, the same lands are described only as tribes, wandering nomads with no unity, no name. Somewhere between those pages, a transformation has occurred. A country has become a collection of clans. An empire has been recast as a wilderness. The change is visible, even in works meant to preserve knowledge. The Encyclopaedia Britannica of 1771 carried a full entry on Tartary, describing its expanse, its climate, its people. Yet by the 1911 edition, that entry was gone. Open the later volume, and the word itself has vanished, as if it had never existed at all. For those who trust official history, this was only correction, the removal of an outdated label. But for those who doubt, it looks like something else, the quiet rewriting of the past. Three possibilities rise from these fragments. One speaks of disaster, of floods of earth that buried cities and erased their beginnings. Another speaks of empire, the Russian Tsars reshaping maps to match their power, dividing Tartaria until nothing of it remained. The last whispers of forbidden history, of archives rewritten, encyclopedias edited, and a name folded away not by accident, but by choice. Each theory stands on its own, yet together they paint a troubling picture. Buried windows, erased maps, vanished entries, forgotten documents. If these were only coincidences, then history is stranger than it seems. But if they are not, if they are pieces of a larger pattern, then the disappearance of Tartaria may not be an accident of time at all. And so we are left with a question that hovers at the edge of silence. If Tartaria truly vanished, what was it that destroyed it? Was it the force of nature, the hand of empire, or the pen of historians? And if none of these alone is enough to explain it, then what else might have been hidden, waiting beneath the layers of earth and the edits of time? Stay with me a little longer, for in the next part we will follow what traces of Tartaria may have endured, and how its echoes still touch our world today. Though the name Tartaria has vanished from maps, echoes of it may still linger in the world we walk through today. Not as clear lines of empire, but as fragments in stone, in story, and even in the bloodlines of those who live across Eurasia. One of the most visible traces lies in architecture. The onion-shaped domes that rise across the skylines of Russia are now symbols of the nation, tied to Moscow's Red Square and beyond. To most, they are purely Russian, reminders of Tsars and Orthodox faith, yet some wonder whether their origin reaches further, part of a design language that once spread across Central Asia. Whether or not they belong to Tartaria, they remain a style that endures, a visual echo of a time when domes and towers may have carried meanings beyond decoration. In folk art too, patterns remain that whisper of older beliefs. Across Central Asia, designs still circle in spirals and radiant suns. Woven into carpets, carved into wood, painted on pottery, these motifs are explained as symbols of energy, of the heavens, of the eternal movement of life. Some call them merely decoration, passed down from ancestors who lived close to the land. Others see them as remnants of a worldview, perhaps even fragments of the knowledge once tied to the towers and domes of a forgotten empire. The memory of Tartaria may also survive in legend. In 18th century Europe, writers sometimes spoke of Atlantis on land, a lost world not drowned beneath the sea but erased from the continents themselves. While their tales were often imagined, the idea reflects a deeper sense, that there are civilizations hidden in plain sight, remembered only in fragments. In the steppes of Central Asia, Turkic and Mongol traditions speak of a great nation that vanished, a story of ancestors who once ruled wide lands, but whose power was swept away. Whether myth or history, these tales suggest that the idea of a great northern empire never entirely faded from memory. Modern discoveries add another layer. In 2018, archaeologists in Kazakhstan uncovered the remains of ancient irrigation systems buried beneath desert sands. Channels and ditches, carefully planned, showed that thousands of years ago people here already controlled water on a vast scale. Such works speak of societies capable of engineering beyond survival, communities that planned for the future. Were they part of Tartaria, or another chapter in the long story of the steppes? No one can say, but their presence deepens the mystery of what once flourished across these lands. Science, too, has added surprising evidence of connection. In 2019, a study published in Nature analysed ancient DNA across Eurasia. The findings revealed that many populations of Europe and Central Asia share common ancestors among the steppe nomads who lived more than 5,000 years ago. The migrations of those riders spread genes, languages, and technologies across continents. In a sense, the steppe has always been a bridge, its people shaping cultures far beyond their horizons. Even if Tartaria as an empire never existed, the genetic legacy of its supposed heartland flows in millions of lives today. When we gather these fragments, domes that still gleam above cities, patterns that circle through folk art, legends that whisper of lost nations, canals hidden in deserts, and DNA that ties east to west, we begin to sense that the idea of Tartaria may not be entirely gone. Perhaps it survives not as a single empire, but as a thread woven through the histories of many peoples, a shadow that stretches into the present. And if these are only the traces we can see, then what else might remain unseen? How many stories still lie hidden in ruins unexcavated, in manuscripts unread, in the quiet codes of culture passed down without words? The story of Tartaria leaves us with more shadows than certainties. Maps, ruins, and legends have carried us this far. But there are whispers of other traces, faint and easily dismissed, that stir the imagination still. In the archives of the 18th and 19th centuries, scattered manuscripts appear that speak of machines vast and strange. They are described not as monuments of worship, but as instruments of power, engines said to stand in the centres of great cities, drawing force from the air and from the ether. The language is vague, the diagrams incomplete, but the suggestion is clear enough: devices that could turn invisible energies into light, heat, and motion. Later scholars dismissed these writings outright. Some were filed under pseudoscience, others were quietly removed from catalogues. Even the fragments that survive are difficult to trace. Passed from one library to another, half erased by the suspicion that they were more invention than record. And yet, one cannot help but wonder, why would anyone, centuries before electricity lit our streets, imagine machines that sound so close to the dreams of modern power? Beneath our feet, too, hints remain. In European cities, when foundations are dug for new buildings, there are times when workers break into chambers deeper than any architect remembers designing. Stone stairways lead downward into rooms filled with earth, their walls worn smooth, their ceilings far below the present street. Engineers explain them as older basements, long forgotten, covered by layers of rebuilding. But for those who follow the mystery of Tartaria, they are something else. Evidence that entire levels of the past still lie beneath us, sealed in silence, waiting. These fragments may mean nothing. They may be accidents, curiosities, the imagination of writers and the shifting of ground. Or they may be echoes of something greater, pieces of a story too large to vanish completely. And so the question lingers. If Tartaria once existed, and its memory was buried beneath maps and time, are we living in a history already rewritten? And if an empire of such scale could vanish, then how many others remain unseen, hidden beneath the soil, sealed in forbidden manuscripts, waiting for the moment when someone dares to look again? Until then, the mystery remains. If this story has kept you company tonight, you may leave a gentle like, so that others may find it too. Share a thought softly in the comments if a question stays with you. And if you wish to drift further into forgotten histories, subscribe and return. The next story will be here whenever you are ready. Good night.